A pastor who married all his wife's daughters, calling it divine proof of purity. This is the case that shook a small religious community in rural Missouri during the mid-1950s, remaining one of American history's most disturbing examples of familial relationships gone terribly wrong. It was the spring of 1956. The Ozarks' rolling hills were in full bloom when a troubling report from a concerned school teacher in Oakwood County reached Deputy Sheriff William Harrington. Martha Jenkins, a dedicated educator at the local elementary school, had noticed something peculiar about the three young Palmer girls. They rarely spoke, exhibited unusual behaviors, and most concerningly, all appeared to bear striking resemblances to one another, despite allegedly being half-sisters. What would soon be uncovered was a horrifying family secret, hidden within a remote religious compound for nearly a decade, beginning with what was thought to be a routine welfare check. Nestled deep in the backwoods, 15 miles from the nearest town, stood the modest wooden church of the Pure Light Congregation. Founded in 1947 by Reverend Elijah Palmer, the small congregation had grown to approximately 40 devoted followers who had removed themselves from mainstream society, seeking what Palmer called untainted spiritual enlightenment. Palmer, a charismatic 49-year-old with piercing blue eyes and a commanding presence, had established the community after claiming to receive divine visions. These visions instructed him to create a lineage of unspoiled vessels. "The Lord has chosen me to preserve the sacred bloodline," Palmer frequently declared to his followers. "Just as the ancient patriarchs kept their family lines pure, we too must follow God's design." Former congregation members would later recall how Palmer gradually introduced increasingly extreme interpretations of biblical passages, focusing particularly on stories of patriarchs who had taken multiple wives from within their extended families. What investigators discovered at the compound would leave even the most hardened officers deeply troubled. Palmer had married Rebecca Wilson in 1946, a widow with 4 daughters aged between 3 and 12. By 1956, Palmer had taken each of Rebecca's daughters as additional spiritual wives once they reached what he deemed the age of purity, 16 years old. The eldest 3 daughters had already borne children who displayed concerning physical and developmental issues. Sheriff's records indicate that Palmer defended his actions by citing biblical precedent, insisting that God had given him special dispensation to purify the bloodline through these unions. Palmer had convinced his followers, and seemingly his wife Rebecca, that these unions were divinely sanctioned, representing the highest form of devotion. The devastating consequences of these consanguineous relationships on the children born within the compound would later be revealed by medical examinations. Dr. Thomas Mitchell, the county physician who examined the children in 1956, noted in his reports multiple cases of developmental delays, skeletal abnormalities, and concerning cognitive impairments consistent with recessive genetic disorders. Through innocent children, the true horror of Palmer's divine lineage was becoming devastatingly clear, children who would bear the physical and mental burden of his distorted beliefs for their entire lives. Check. If you're already subscribed to this channel, a single episode of these shocking historical investigations, revealing the darkest corners of humanity's hidden past, is something you won't want to miss. To understand how Elijah Palmer's horrific family arrangement persisted for nearly a decade, one must examine the isolated social environment and the manipulative theological framework he meticulously constructed. Former members described a gradual progression of increasingly extreme interpretations of religious texts, with Palmer positioning himself as the sole interpreter of divine will. Brother Elijah had answers for everything, recalled former congregation member Thomas Winters in a 1957 interview. He would spend hours showing us passages that he claimed proved his special status. After years of isolation, many of us lost the ability to question him. From ancient religious texts, Palmer strategically selected passages that mentioned patriarchal figures with multiple wives or marriages between relatives, deliberately taking them out of context to justify his own disturbing arrangements. Palmer maintained strict control over the community through multiple mechanisms. The compound was geographically isolated, situated deep in the Ozark forests at the end of a narrow dirt road often impassable during winter months. Members were discouraged from maintaining relationships with outsiders, including extended family. Palmer preached that the outside world was spiritually contaminated and that contact would pollute their divine purpose. Another powerful tool was economic control. Community members pooled resources and surrendered personal property upon joining. Palmer controlled all finances, meaning those who questioned his authority risked not only spiritual condemnation but also destitution. "We had nowhere to go and no resources to start over," former member Sarah Thompson later testified. Many stayed simply because they couldn't see an alternative. Perhaps most disturbing was the community's educational isolation. Children were homeschooled using materials created by Palmer himself. Science and biology were taught through a heavily distorted lens that normalized consanguineous relationships. The children were taught that maintaining pure bloodlines was biologically beneficial, directly contradicting established genetic science that had been understood since the early 20th century. In this tragic story, Palmer's wife, Rebecca Wilson Palmer, presents a particularly complex figure. Court transcripts reveal a woman torn between maternal protection and religious devotion. Raised in an extremely traditional religious household herself, Rebecca had been widowed at age 30 when her first husband died in a factory accident. With 4 young daughters and minimal education, Rebecca was vulnerable when she met the charismatic Palmer at a revival meeting in 1945. Rebecca believed she was protecting her daughters by keeping them within the family. Psychologist Dr. Eleanor Reed noted in her 1958 assessment, her understanding of the outside world had been so distorted that she genuinely believed her daughters were safer as Palmer's spiritual wives than they would be in normal society. This tragic misunderstanding would have devastating consequences across generations. Historical records and personal journals recovered from the compound reveal how Palmer gradually introduced his disturbing practices. He first married Rebecca in a traditional ceremony, establishing himself as a stepfather to her daughters. Over the following years, he slowly introduced the concept of spiritual marriage, initially claiming these were merely symbolic unions. By the time the eldest daughter turned 16, Palmer had completely rewritten the community's understanding of family structure. The isolation meant that when Palmer's first stepdaughter gave birth to a child with visible genetic abnormalities in 1953, there was no medical professional to identify the probable cause. Instead, Palmer interpreted these developmental issues as purification challenges, claiming the child's condition was due to lingering spiritual contamination from the outside world rather than the inevitable consequence of genetic relatedness. The most heartbreaking aspect of the Palmer case was the profound impact on the children born within this closed family system. Court records indicate that by 1956, 8 children had been born to Palmer's unions with his stepdaughters, with 5 displaying significant health complications typical of offspring from consanguineous relationships. Dr. James Harrison, a geneticist who consulted on the case in 1957, provided testimony explaining how consanguineous relationships dramatically increased the risk of genetic disorders. When closely related individuals have children together, recessive genetic conditions that may be carried without symptoms in the general population become significantly more likely to appear. The closer the biological relationship, the higher the risk. Medical records from county hospitals documented children with conditions including congenital heart defects, skeletal malformations, intellectual disabilities, and compromised immune systems. Most troubling were the patterns of progressively worsening conditions in subsequent generations as genetic issues compounded over time. Check. If you're already subscribed to this channel, a single episode of these shocking historical investigations, revealing the darkest corners of humanity's hidden past, is something you won't want to miss. A 7-year-old Joseph, born to Palmer and his eldest stepdaughter, exemplified these challenges. Hospital records describe a child who, at age 7, could barely speak, suffered frequent respiratory infections, and had pronounced skeletal asymmetry. School records from the brief period when Palmer's children attended public school showed significant developmental delays across multiple domains. Beyond the physical manifestations, psychologists noted profound emotional trauma among all the children. Dr. Elizabeth Monroe, who evaluated the children after their removal from the compound, wrote, "These children display severe attachment disruption, confusion about family relationships, and significant difficulty with social interaction. Their understanding of normal familial bonds has been so distorted that rehabilitative care will be extraordinarily challenging. The case highlighted a dangerous gap in public understanding of genetics in 1950s America. While scientific communities had comprehended the risks of consanguinity for decades, this knowledge hadn't permeated rural religious communities. This knowledge deficit allowed Palmer to propose his own pseudoscientific theories about blood purity that directly contradicted established medical science. If you've been moved by this tragic story, leave a comment saying, "These innocent children deserve better," so we can recognize how these hidden historical tragedies still resonate with us today. The most haunting aspect of the Palmer case was the multigenerational impact that extended far beyond the initial discovery. Court-appointed guardian Helen Martinez would later write, "The true tragedy of these unions isn't just the immediate suffering, but how the consequences echoed through subsequent generations." Children born with developmental challenges would face lifelong struggles, and their capacity to lead independent lives was severely compromised from birth. Particularly revealing were the personal diaries of Palmer's second eldest stepdaughter, Catherine, discovered during the investigation. Her writings revealed a young woman caught between indoctrination and an intuitive understanding that something was profoundly wrong. "I look at my son and see his struggles," she wrote in 1955. "Sometimes I wonder if what Father Elijah teaches us about purity is true. My heart breaks watching little Thomas struggle to learn things that come easily to other children." The heartbreaking reality was that even as some family members began to question the arrangement, they lacked the educational framework to understand the true cause of their children's struggles. Having been isolated from mainstream education and medical care, the concepts of genetics and heredity remained unknown to them, allowing Palmer's religious explanations to fill this knowledge void. The Palmer case might have continued indefinitely had it not been for the persistence of elementary school teacher Martha Jenkins. When the three youngest Palmer children briefly attended the local school during a period when county officials had increased pressure on the compound to comply with education laws, Jenkins noticed troubling signs. The children wouldn't make eye contact, seemed fearful of adults, and appeared physically similar despite being introduced as half-siblings. Most concerning were their drawings during art class, Jenkins later testified, which depicted highly unusual family structures and contained disturbing religious imagery inappropriate for children their age. Jenkins reported her concerns to the county welfare office in March 1956, but initially received little response. In rural Missouri in the 1950s, child protection resources were limited, and religious communities were often given significant latitude in family matters. Undeterred, Jenkins began documenting her observations meticulously, creating a file of concerning behaviors, statements, and artwork from the Palmer children. The breakthrough came when one of the children, 9-year-old Ruth, became ill at school with a high fever. When Jenkins attempted to contact the family, she discovered the telephone number provided on school records was disconnected. Following protocol, she had the child transported to the county hospital. The examining physician, Dr. Harold Wilson, noted unusual developmental markers and genetic characteristics that raised immediate concerns about potential consanguinity. The child presented with distinctive facial features, skeletal proportions, and neurological responses that suggested possible genetic complications associated with consanguineous parentage, Dr. Wilson noted in his report. When questioned about her family, the child provided information that raised serious welfare concerns. On April 12, 1956, Deputy Sheriff William Harrington, accompanied by county social worker Eleanor Price, drove the 15 miles of winding forest roads to the Palmer compound. What began as a routine welfare check quickly escalated when Harrington observed multiple pregnant teenagers, who were identified as Palmer's spiritual wives but bore striking resemblances to one another. When confronted, Palmer remained defiant, citing religious freedom and presenting his own handwritten theological justification for the family arrangement. Rebecca Palmer, appearing significantly older than her 40 years, defended her husband while showing signs of what psychologists would later identify as severe coercive control. The initial investigation revealed living conditions that compounded the family tragedy. The compound consisted of a main chapel building surrounded by small, sparsely furnished cabins. Educational materials examined by authorities contained deeply concerning content, including handwritten texts by Palmer that explicitly promoted consanguineous relationships as spiritually superior. County Prosecutor Martin Davis initially struggled with how to approach the case. Missouri laws regarding consanguinity in the 1950s focused primarily on direct blood relatives, creating a legal gray area regarding Palmer's relationships with his stepdaughters. Eventually, Davis built a case around child endangerment, statutory violations, and fraud related to Palmer's manipulation of community resources. The raid on the compound on May 3, 1956, involved county sheriff's deputies, social services, and medical personnel. 17 children were taken into protective custody while Palmer, Rebecca, and several adult members of the congregation were detained for questioning. Medical examinations of the children confirmed the worst fears of authorities, with doctors documenting numerous health issues consistent with genetic complications from consanguinity. Perhaps the most damning evidence came from Palmer's own writings. Investigators discovered journals dating back to 1946 that revealed his strategy had been premeditated from the beginning. "The widow Wilson is perfect for our purpose," Palmer wrote shortly after meeting Rebecca. "Her daughters are young enough to be properly molded, and her devotion to spiritual matters makes her unlikely to question divine guidance." The trial of Elijah Palmer began on September 10, 1956, in the Oakwood County Courthouse. National newspapers descended on the small Missouri town, though many publications struggled with how to describe the case given the social taboos surrounding consanguinity. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch referred to it as a case of unspeakable family arrangements, while avoiding direct descriptions that would violate public decency standards of the era. Palmer maintained his religious defense throughout the proceedings, representing himself after multiple court-appointed attorneys withdrew from the case. His closing statement revealed the depth of his delusion: "What you call a crime, God calls divine selection." The ancient patriarchs understood what modern science has forgotten, that purity of bloodline creates vessels worthy of divine presence. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on 14 counts. Judge Hamilton Wilson sentenced Palmer to 30 years in the Missouri State Penitentiary, stating, "In my 40 years on the bench, I have never encountered a more deliberate corruption of religious principles to justify acts that violate the most fundamental moral boundaries of civilized society." Rebecca Palmer received a reduced sentence of 7 years after psychological evaluation suggested she had been subjected to years of coercive control. The 3 eldest stepdaughters were not charged, being recognized as victims despite having reached adulthood by the time of the trial. Their testimony provided crucial insights into how Palmer's indoctrination had warped their understanding of normal family relationships. The fate of the 17 children removed from the compound represents both the tragedy of the case and the limitations of 1950s social services. The children were initially placed in the Oakwood County Children's Home, an underfunded facility ill-equipped to address their complex medical and psychological needs. Period photographs show a stark institutional setting that offered physical safety but little therapeutic support. Dr. Marion Lewis, who conducted psychological assessments of the Palmer children from 1957 to 1960, documented their difficult adjustment. These children face extraordinary challenges beyond the physical health complications. They struggle with basic social concepts that most children absorb naturally. Their understanding of family, physical boundaries, and interpersonal relationships has been so profoundly distorted that conventional foster placement proved nearly impossible for many. The long-term outcomes for the Palmer children reflect the inadequacy of mid-century social services for such complex cases. Records indicate that 5 of the children with the most severe developmental challenges were eventually transferred to state institutions, where many remained into adulthood. 9 children were eventually placed with foster families, though placement instability was common. Only 3 of the 17 children would go on to complete high school, with most struggling with lifelong health and social adjustment difficulties. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the Palmer case was its influence on the development of modern child protective services. Social work historian Dr. Eleanor Montgomery has identified the case as a catalyst for significant reforms. The Palmer case exposed critical gaps in how authorities identified and responded to extreme family situations, particularly those disguised by religious pretexts. The case directly influenced the development of specialized training for teachers, medical professionals, and social workers in identifying signs of concerning family structures. In the decades following, Missouri and other states strengthened laws regarding consanguinity, child welfare monitoring, and oversight of isolated religious communities. The case became required reading in social work programs throughout the Midwest during the 1960s and 70s, though often in heavily redacted form given the sensitive nature of the material. As for the Pure Light congregation, it dissolved almost immediately after Palmer's arrest. The compound buildings were abandoned and eventually reclaimed by the surrounding forest. A 1976 newspaper feature located several former adult members who had reintegrated into mainstream society. Many expressed profound guilt over their failure to recognize or stop Palmer's actions, with one former elder stating, "We were so focused on the spiritual that we became blind to the human suffering right before our eyes." If you've watched all the way through this disturbing historical case, leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end, so I can get to know who really appreciates these in-depth historical investigations." Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more hidden historical cases that reveal the darkest chapters of human behavior. Like and share this video if you found it informative, as spreading awareness about these historical tragedies helps ensure they're never repeated. The Palmer case remains a sobering reminder of how isolation, manipulation of religious texts, and exploitation of vulnerable individuals can create environments where unimaginable family arrangements persist, hidden from public view. While medical science had long established the genetic dangers of consanguinity, this knowledge failed to reach or protect those most vulnerable to exploitation. The tragic genetic legacy borne by innocent children serves as a powerful testament to why societies must remain vigilant against extreme isolation and the distortion of religious principles to justify harmful practices.